Back in the 1970s, the Japanese car manufacturers had gained themselves a bit of a reputation as makers of sensible, practical, cheap, good value for money and reliable family cars. But they wanted more. For them to stand head and shoulders next to their Western counterparts, they also wanted to become desirable. And that meant one thing: sports cars. Now, many will credit Mazda with the MX-5 in the late 1980s as being the car that really turned the Japanese fortunes around. But it was actually this car, the Toyota MR2, which came out years before, that we should really be thankful for. Welcome to this week's Retro Reviews. Welcome to the Toyota MR2 story. Please sit yourself down, make yourself comfortable in the house of cars. Now, this might be difficult for some of our younger viewers to comprehend, but this is quite a pivotal car, not just for Toyota as a brand, but also for the Japanese manufacturers overall. And whilst there had been sports cars from Japan before, none quite had the same impact as the MR2. And it's now over 40 years old, but across 3 generations, it really has cemented its place in history, and it's had a massive impact on a lot of automotive fans across the globe, including a young chap who grew up in Scotland whose uncles had a Toyota franchise, because I remember the launch of the car back in 1983 in Campbell Toyota in Lockerbie, which is why I wanted to tell the story of the car. So that's what we're going to do today in this first of our new series of retro reviews, where we take a look at some classics from yesteryear. Except some of these don't feel like classics to me, but they might to you. And if they do, and you think this is going to be a good idea and you want to watch more, then make sure you're subscribed to the House of Cars channel. And of course, turn on your notifications so you don't miss another episode when it goes live. Right, let's make a start on the Toyota MR2 story. Now, Datsun, as it was at the time, had already given the world the 240Z and shown that the Japanese could build world-beating sports cars. But Toyota had been slightly less than successful in the sports car arena up until then. Yes, they had given us the achingly pretty 2000 GT and in 1965 the Sport 800, but it hardly set people's pulses racing. So in the 1970s, it started to develop its supermodel to go up against cars such as the Ford Mustang. But it wasn't exactly sort of like the car that was going to capture the hearts of many. And of course, the fuel crisis of the 1970s turned people's attention to more frugal cars, which of course Toyota had vast experience in, but maybe not so much frugal sports cars. So a plan was hatched. A man called Akio Yoshida, who would go on to be the MR2's chief development officer, had spent a lot of time over in California on the west coast of America and noticed that a lot of the younger buyers out there were buying small, inexpensive British sports cars such as MGs and Triumphs. So it would be this end of the market that Toyota would target, because they'd never really had the success with sports cars in the North American market, a key market for the brand, because the S800 had never been sold there, mostly due to its diminutive size. So the land of the rising sun would target the land of the free with their new 2-seater sports car. And it took inspiration from slightly more exotic machinery such as the Ferrari 308 and of course the Lotus Esprit and the Matra Murena. But its main source of inspiration would come from much more humble origins, the Fiat X19. Now, because Toyota had been brilliant at building sort of like small economical cars up until now, they had a great range of small fuel-efficient engines which they could use in their new sports car. But the design and the engineering layout of it followed those more exotic machinery with 2 seats and an engine behind to give it a mid-engine layout, hence the name of the car, the midship runabout 2-seater. Now, the first prototype broke cover in 1981, the SAX, and of course it showed typical Toyota attention to detail with beautifully flush-fitting bumpers, integrated pop-up headlights, tight shut lines and nice flush door handles. The car was also going to be engineered by All-American hero Dan Gurney as well, which would certainly lend it some kudos to the North American market. And even that design showed more than a passing resemblance to Pontiac's Fiero. But this was a car that had to make sure that the cost was going to be kept quite low. So as the car developed and as it progressed towards production, some of those more tight-fitting lines and flush bumpers and such like gave way to much more sensible and, dare I suggest, easier to manufacture normal style bumpers. Mechanisms for the pop-up headlights would be used from cars that Toyota already produced, such as the then popular Celica. And of course its engine, well, as I say, that would come from its Corolla range. At the very glamorous 1983 Tokyo Motor Show, Toyota showed a concept car, the SV3, which was pretty much a production-ready version of what would become the MR2. The only things that really changed between that concept and the production car was a revised rear spoiler to help with high-speed stability, and the big glass panel roof would give way to a standard pop-up sunroof. On the inside, some of the more elaborate sort of LCD instrumentation would give way to standard Toyota parts bin stuff, but that was good because that meant the price could be kept in check. And of course the rather futuristic, certainly for the time, driver and passenger intercom system from the head restraints, well, that wouldn't see production at all. But pretty much the car that they showed is pretty much the car that they built. And as I say, a year later, in 1984, Toyota launched the MR2 to rapturous applause. The engine that Toyota chose to power the MR2 was its 1.6 double overhead cam 16 valve A engine that had seen sterling work in the Corolla and Tercel models. It produced 112 horsepower, and it had quite a clever little valve system in it, because at low speed, at low revs, two of the valves would close to give better torque, and then they would open again at much higher revs to make sure that the peak power was delivered. That peak power meant decent performance. 0 to 60 was sub 8 seconds. It showed a clean pair of heels to the rather, well, archaic Fiat X19. Even Pontiac's Fiero with the 2.5 litre engine was left trailing in the MR2's wake, because despite a bigger engine, Pontiac had chosen to tune it more for economy rather than performance, something that sports car buyers really did crave. The other interesting thing with it was that it also gave you the option of automatic transmission and air conditioning, which will be crucial in that North American market. But it gave buyers something else that they just hadn't been used to with their MGs and Triumphs before: reliability. In fact, the only thing that the MR2 really lacked was a fully folding convertible roof. Now, during the 1970s, the Americans had really fallen out of love with the convertible due to safety concerns, despite the fact there was still an awful lot of buyers looking for them. Now, the MR2 was never conceived to be a convertible because of this reason. Despite the fact that there was some aftermarket options available to them, it was never something that the factory offered. But for those who did crave that wind in the hair experience, help would soon arrive in the form of the MR2 T-Bar. Now, when Toyota first showed the SV3 concept at the 1983 Tokyo show, it had a removable glass panel roof. But the T-Bar would go on to have two detachable glass panel roofs and retain a central spine, and the panels could be stored neatly behind the driver and passenger seat, giving you that wind in the hair feeling without compromising the structural rigidity and engineering that had gone into the car. And for those that wanted more power, that would arrive in the form of a supercharged version in certain markets. And with certain markets, some people wanted a car that was less expensive, so more stripped out, more basic ones were also available. In fact, there was a lot of different derivatives across the globe. The only real change was in the French-speaking markets, where the car was simply known as the Toyota MR. Because if you say MR2 in French, MR2, well, it doesn't particularly show off in a good light. Nevertheless, lots of people loved it, including the global press, because they absolutely showered it with plaudits. And the buying public weren't exactly shy either, because 37,000 of these found homes within the first year of production. And that helped cement Toyota as the makers of small, brilliant to drive, and crucially, reliable sports cars. And the legend of the MR2 was born. I haven't driven a Generation 1 MR2 in decades, but you know what? It still feels like an absolute joy to me. And here's the thing with it, it doesn't really feel like an old car. That's the thing. That's the key thing that Toyota did with the MR2 that makes it such a wonderful little sports car. If you jumped in this back in the early 1980s, having been used to, say, an MGB or a midget, bearing in mind MG were still producing the MGB in 1980, this must have felt like a different world. It's as light and easy to drive as a Yaris, this is. Okay, unassisted steering, but other than that, you've got a really nice light clutch, you've got a really slick little gear shift, 5-speed, it slots home really nicely. Unassisted steering that just makes it very, very easy to place. The engine revs lovely, bit noisy, but I've still come down the motorway, the M23, at 75, 80 miles an hour, and it was all right. You notice more wind noise, obviously, because technology's changed around about window sealing, and that's about it. But it's not taxing to drive. You know, you're not getting out with your ears bleeding or your back absolutely in bits. I've got electric windows, I've got electric mirrors. I don't have air conditioning in this one, but you could have had it. You know, I've got a nice radio cassette, and I've got a perfect driving position. That's the other thing about the MR2, is the driving position is absolutely spot on. Now, you've got this quite high tunnel here, because that's obviously where the fuel tank was fitted. So the engine up at the back, and then the fuel tank was under here, so you get this quite high tunnel. But that lends itself really, really well to having this really nice driving position, which is almost sort of perfect, really. And because it is, dare I suggest, that older style of car, you've got that really nice sort of, you've got thin pillars here, you can place it really easily, you can just see the apex of the corner, and it's a diminutive car. It's a really little car. That's the best thing about it. So easy to see out of, easy to drive, and small. It's the perfect little sports car, but it's not uncomfortable. I've got electric mirrors, as I say, I've got electric windows, I've got all sort of like mod cons in some respects you could have. The only thing you don't have is a 6th gear to, help it at higher revs. But other than that, it's perfect. Pedals, beautifully placed, absolutely beautifully placed. It's really easy to understand the impact this car had on not just the motoring press, but the buying public alike. Because I say nobody had really done a sports car like this, that was that sort of easy to drive as you would get with, say, a Toyota Corolla or any other sort of like car that Toyota was building at the time, and dare I suggest had that sort of reliability as well, but yet looked like this and drove like this. They really absolutely hit the nail on the head with the MR2 when they conceived it. The X19 Fiat, obviously was sort of like the main competitor for the car when this came out. And that felt quite archaic in some respects in comparison to this. It felt like an old school sports car. Maybe not quite as archaic as an old MG, but archaic nonetheless. This was the future. And boy, what a future it was. Talking of the future, can I just say that I think Toyota's designers and engineers knew something the rest of us didn't back then. Because my iPhone slots absolutely perfectly into that little cubby tray on top of the dashboard. Obviously knew something we didn't. As the 1980s drew to a close, Toyota realised that the buyers of small two-seater sports cars were a fickle, fashion-conscious bunch. Or at least that's what their market research had told them. They wanted something a bit more grown up, a little bit more refined perhaps, something that maybe looked like a Ferrari, but still cost the same as a Toyota. And so the second generation MR2 was quite considerably larger than the first generation. And of course, with it being a bigger car, it needed a bigger engine to move it around. So a 2-litre 16 valve was installed, still in the middle of it, but the radiators were now moved to the front, because of course that would then free up more interior space and more luggage space, something that buyers were looking for. Aerodynamics would play a much bigger role in car design now, so the car changed a huge amount in terms of the way that it looked. And of course, lessons learned from Toyota's Lexus program were transferred into the MR2 to make sure that it was very, very refined when people drove it, when they got to drive it. Because whilst the car broke cover in 1989, it would be a full 12 months before the crucial North American market got their hands on it. And that was a problem, because in the intervening 12 months, Mazda had launched the MX-5, which was a small two-seater, 1.6 litre engine, soft-top car of similar size to the Mark I MR2, which was lapping the sales up. Never mind, Toyota thought, people will flock to the new MR2 because it's more grown up, it's much more sophisticated, and that's what our market research has shown that people want. Unfortunately, the market research was wrong. To make matters worse, in 1990, Car Magazine ran a cover story on how the new Toyota MR2's handling was now almost dangerous. It had the propensity to go into snap oversteer at a moment's notice. Was the car dangerous? Not really. It's just that the market that the MR2 sold into hadn't really been used to this sort of exotic mechanical layout before. They'd all been brought up on front-wheel drive hot hatchbacks, yet here was a rear-wheel drive mid-mounted engine in a small two-seater sports car. The issue lay with the tie rods and the rear suspension, and these are the rods that control the movement of toe in and toe out as the suspension itself moves up and down. And of course, with them being of a slightly shorter than ideal nature, it did alter the rear wheel slightly, enabling the car to go into oversteer if you weren't ready for it. And that's despite the fact that the chassis was yet again tuned by Dan Gurney. In 1993, Toyota rushed out a revision for the car with longer tie rods. However, unfortunately, the damage had been done, and the second generation car never really captured the buyer's imagination in quite the same way that the Mark I MR2 had done. Now, two models of the second generation car were offered. One with a slightly lower powered 138 horsepower engine, which you could identify because it didn't have the rear wing or front fog lights and was only available as a coupe. Or you could have the more powerful 158 horsepower version, obviously which got the rear wing and fog lights and was available as a T-bar. And remember, the T-bar was also introduced right from day one in the second generation car. Toyota weren't going to make that mistake again. But despite all that, and despite the revisions made to the car, it was withdrawn from the important US market in 1995, although it would live on across in Europe and its own home market in Japan. Although things weren't looking rosy for the MR2, because the Japanese domestic financial situation during sort of like the mid-1990s certainly didn't look rosy. And across in the UK, a very important market for the car, well, we had our own problems. Joyriders and rising insurance costs. And of course, it was at that time the MR2 disappeared with no sign of a replacement. Now, when you jump in the second generation car, it's immediately obvious that this is a more grown-up, more sophisticated car, but it still feels like an MR2. Here's the thing, it's going to sound like a weird analogy. You know the program The Crown in Netflix? You know, when you've got, you know, different actresses playing Queen Elizabeth through the ages. It's still the same character, but you can see them mature through each different sort of like actress that plays her. Each generation of Queen Elizabeth, same character, more mature. That's what it's like. Immediately you are reminded of the first generation car. You know, you've got this high transmission tunnel, so the fuel tank is underneath that. You've got this wand-like sort of, you know, pistol grip style transmission lever that just, you know, with a 5-speed gearbox that just feels as slick and as smooth as it does. You know, light controls that you get, you know, because it's a Toyota. You know, still that low slung driving position. But you're in a bigger car, obviously, and it's, you know, slightly quieter, and there's a bit more, less wind noise, and the controls just feel that little bit more modern and things like that. But the character of the MR2 is still here. And you've still got, you know, that mid-engined layout, as all three cars do. Obviously, it grew in size. It's now a 2-litre 16 valve. This car that I'm in here is the more powerful GTI 16, so this is the 158 horsepower version. There was a non-GT car, but you couldn't have that with the T-bar. This isn't a T-bar, by the way, this is a standard fixed roof coupe. And this isn't one of the this particular car isn't one of those revised cars from the early 90s. Well, you know, 93 onwards. This is the original, the first iteration of the Generation 2 car. comfortable driving seat, still a non-assisted steering, but of course it's fine because obviously you can, you know, it's mid-engine, there's no real weight over the front as it is, so you've still got, you know, a nice precise uncorrupted steering feel from the car. It does get quite light at speed, that's the one thing that you do notice, but coming down the motorway here in this Mark II car, as I say, it's quieter. It's just a little bit more comfortable. The Mark 1 did not feel uncomfortable in terms of, you know, sitting on a motorway, but this one at 80 miles an hour is quieter and more refined. And as I said, that's part of what Toyota wanted to do with the car. And of course, at this point of generation of car, they had obviously been developing the Lexus, the LS400. So as I say, a lot of the lessons that they learned in refining that car, sound deadening material, eliminating wind noise, that type of thing, found its way onto the MR2 as well, and you can really tell there's a big difference. There's a bit more compliancy in the suspension as well. Still quite fun, still a sporty car, but you know, it's not quite as crashy. There's a little bit more bump absorption. As well as fitting the bigger engine, they moved the radiators as well. So the radiators moved forward to free up more space. It gives more space for the interior occupants, as well as more luggage space as well. And you just got sort of like slightly more refined switchgear as well, so the pop-up lights are no longer on a sort of like a turning dial up on the dashboard. They're on the end of the indicator stock. You know, the wipers are the same. They're not the dial up on the dashboard. They're a traditional indicator stock. So it's more of what you've sort of been used to, and it's still as easy to drive as a Corolla. I didn't really want to sort of like go into this in this film, but I have to admit, there's a little bit of nostalgia here with me. Now, this car reminds me of my dad, and I need to just tell a little story here. My dad passed away 16 years ago now, and I have to admit something quite terrible. Him and I weren't talking when he passed away. We hadn't spoken in quite a number of months before he died, and I never got to speak to him before I died. I don't really think about it too much. But I sat in this car today, and I haven't driven a Mark II MR2 for, well, quite a long time. And it just reminded me of his Toyota Camry. He was a Toyota man. I learned to drive. He had a 1987 Camry that I learned to drive in. You know, the tape deck's the same. You know, the seat material feels familiar. The key was the same. You know, just picking the key up just felt like my dad's old car. You know, all of the switchgear comes out of the Camry. And it just really reminded, even the smell just reminded me of his Camry, and it just brought a lot of memories back to me. Good memories, you know, me learning to drive in my dad's car. But my point is, that's the great thing with the MR2. It feels special, and it does still get, even this newer car is getting a lot of looks from people, but it still is easy to drive as a Toyota. And that's why these make really, really good buys, I think. You know, if you were thinking of, as I said to you before on the Mark 1 car, if you were thinking of, you know, you wanted a modern classic that was easy to live with, this is the perfect car, you know, in some respects, because, you know, it feels special still, but it's a very, very easy car to live with. You know, there's nothing strenuous about driving this car. You know, there's no choke or anything like that. It's fuel injection, it's 16 valve, it's relatively fuel efficient. You know, it's quite a modern engine in some respects, and the controls are nice and easy to use. So I have to admit, this is probably one of those cars that if somebody said to me, I want something a little bit, you know, a little bit older, a little bit fun for a Sunday afternoon drive, but I'm not into sort of like really old, you know, smelly old cars and stuff, and something that might just, you know, creep up in value a little bit, I'd be tempted to say an MR2. Because that's this car. But as I say, my point is, there's something about the MR2 that's just a really nice, easy car to sort of like live with. It feels special still, you know. It feels like a special car. It is a special car. There's no doubt about that, and it's familiar to anyone who's driven a Toyota from this era. The third generation car didn't start life as an official Toyota program. It was a sort of skunk works idea between the designers and the engineers. But Toyota management saw what they were up to, and they green-lighted a concept car for 1995, which got them thinking, was it time to give the little MR2 another chance? For this car, Toyota would finally take notice of what the buying public actually wanted, which was a small, two-seater, open-top sports car. The evergreen Mazda MX-5 was still selling in droves. Rover's MGF was another car that gained huge popularity during this time, and it knew of new premium brands also getting into the Roadster market. Porsche with the Boxster, Mercedes-Benz with the SLK, BMW with the Z3, and of course Audi with the TT Roadster. So this time the MR2 was going to follow suit. In 1997, Toyota showed the MRS concept, which would go on 2 years later to be the production version of the MR2, although some markets would actually retain, confusingly, that MRS badge rather than going down the route of being called the MR2. But Toyota stuck to a relatively proven sort of like track in the sense that it would be a mid-engined two-seater sports car. But as I say, this time it would be a fully folding convertible. And still stung by the handling criticism of the second generation car, a huge amount of attention was paid to the way that the car actually drove. The fuel tank, which had been mounted centrally in the first two generation cars, would be moved backwards to underneath the engine. And whilst the car was actually shorter and more diminutive than the second generation car, its wheelbase was actually 5 centimetres longer, with the wheels being pushed right to the edges of it to quell any thoughts of snap oversteer. And again, the engine itself came from Toyota's vast parts bin, the 1.8 litre engine that they used that produced 138 brake horsepower. But the key difference with the Mark III MR2 was its weight, because Toyota realised if they were going to make a fun sports car for people without using a big, powerful engine, the key to making it fun was to get its weight down. And that's what they did, because it tipped the scales at a barely believable 975 kilos for excellent performance. However, there was a bit of an issue again. Because they had made the car much smaller than the second generation car, it's a foot shorter, remember. There really wasn't anywhere to put any luggage. There was no boot on the car. Whilst there's a small bit of luggage space up at the front and a couple of little bins behind the seats, that was it. It certainly wasn't the practical car that the first and second generation cars had proved to be. And that then also gave it another problem as to how it would be marketed. In certain markets, it was seen as a young, vibrant sort of person's car. In others, it was focused as a driver's car. The Australian market, however, thought it was a bit more of an empty nester's car, which meant that the car had a little bit of a sort of like confused sort of like gestation period. Nobody really knew what it wanted to be. And if that wasn't bad enough either, well, whilst its styling isn't bad, it didn't exactly give the baby Ferrari looks of the second generation car, or the crisp, clean styling of the first gen. And yet, despite all of that, it was this third generation car that finally won the accolades for being the best driving MR2. Toyota had built a proper little sports car, and the press lapped it up. They loved the way that this car drove. The problem was, nobody really bought it. You see, despite the fact that it was the new Toyota MR2, it was being far outsold by the then 5-year-old MGF. And in the sales in the US, in its first year, it achieved just 7,000 units, a far cry from the 37,000 that the Mark I had achieved. And so in 2006, we finally bid farewell to the Toyota MR2. I've got a bit of a confession to make. This is actually the first time I've driven the third generation MR2. Driven lots of the first and second gens, but this is the first one of the Mark IIIs I've driven. So it's a little bit of a voyage of discovery for me, this. And immediately you can tell that it's part of the same family, but it is very different. It is. because what's unique is it feels a little bit like the first generation car because it's diminutive in size. So you sit really in the car and you're really sort of like close to everything, you know. So it's not a big car, it's tiny. But obviously, with it being a soft top, you're much more exposed to the elements. You've got much more sense of the engine note in the car as well. But you lose that big centre console because obviously what they did was they moved the fuel tank from the centre of the car to underneath the engine in the back. And as I say, it's a foot shorter than the second generation car, but it's actually got a longer wheelbase. It's 5 centimetres longer. And they've pushed the wheels right out to the very extremities of the car to help with that wayward handling that you can maybe sometimes get in a mid-engine car. But the key thing with this car is weight, or dare I suggest lack of it, because this is under a ton, this car. 975 kilos this weighs, and it's not a particularly powerful engine. It's not like they threw loads and loads of power at the MR2 through its life. They haven't, you know. It's only still 138 horsepower, so it's way down on a second generation car. But in terms of the way the car feels, in terms of the way that the car drives, it doesn't feel like it's got that anywhere near that amount of deficit. Now obviously it is a much more modern car, and you've got much more modern running gear in it, and you've got this lovely little 1.8 engine just sitting just behind the seats here. 6-speed gearbox at last. They've got a 6-speed gearbox, which is welcome, I have to admit. The gear ratios are spot on, I would suggest. They are absolutely spot on for this type of car. But what a joyful little car. This was the one that all the press really praised for its handling, and I can understand why, because this thing drives beautifully. This is as good, in fact, no, let me just be very clear about that. This is better than an MGF. I've got quite a lot of experience with MGF. I worked for Rover in the mid-90s, so of course I was around when MGF was new, and I drove a lot of them, and I like the MGF. It's a good car. And a car like this, it's also mid-engine, but this is better. You can really chuck this car into bend. Non-assisted steering again, and it's got this lovely delicate thin steering wheel, which is just the right sort of diameter for you. Your thumbs just fall into the spokes, and it just gives you this beautiful control over the steering. It's a little bit stiffer on the suspension than the other two cars as well, so it's not quite as much compliancy in the car as you get from the other two. Dare I suggest they went much more down the route of sports car rather than GT style car that certainly the Mark II was. And with the lack of luggage space available to you, that's probably not a bad thing. But you really get a lot of joy from extending that 1.8 engine up the rev range. It really, really sings when you get it up there. It's a really nice little engine, far nicer than you got out of the MGF, the K series. So it's much nicer than that engine. And it's well seen that why Toyota engines went on to sort of like be used by Lotus and Caterham as well. So it's well seen as to why they would use the Toyota unit, because it's a really nice little engine in this car. The chassis just feels right. It feels planted, but it also feels like it's probably not going to forgive you if you really get it wrong. You've really got to drive the car. It's not going to do it for you. But then, like the other two, the interesting thing with it is it's a Toyota, which means it's really easy to drive. The controls are really, really light. They work. Everything's where you sort of expect to find it. You know, you've got air conditioning in this one. You know, your stereo's but a finger stretch away. You know, everything's where you expect it to be. This was never meant, you know, they never meant to develop a third generation car as such. You know, it never took over straight away from the second gen car. It was quite a few years in the making, this car. And as I say, it did start off as a sort of skunk works project. It wasn't something that Toyota management went ahead and actually sort of like said, right, let's go ahead and put a new MR2 together. But you get the funny feeling that it's probably all the better because of that, because when it's been left up to designers and engineers, what they've actually come up with is, in some respects, the car that the MR2 was always destined to be. And that's not saying that the first generation car is a bad car, not at all. It's still one of my absolute favourite cars. I love that little car, I really do. But this is the pinnacle of the MR2. Now, the other interesting thing with it is, as well as being, as I say, quite easy to drive, it's also quite comfortable. That's the other thing about it. I've just gone down the motorway with the roof down at sort of like, you know, motorway speeds. Okay, you've got a little wind deflector there, which helps. You know, there's no doubt about that, and keeping the side windows up certainly helps as well. But the seats are comfortable. The driving position is the thing that really reminds you that you're in the MR2, because it's this dead on ahead position. You really sit down in the car. Everything feels, as I say, at your fingertips. Everything feels in the right place. And that's what makes you realise that they really knew what they were doing. You know, when they were developing this car and they were putting they were going to put the MR2 badge on it, they had one eye on back what made the first two generations really quite as special as they were. And it's that immediacy that you have as a driver with the car, that intimacy that you have with all the controls, and that shines through in this third generation car. So whilst it might not look like the first two generation MR2s, and maybe in some respects it doesn't drive like them, there's no doubt about it, when you're in it, it still feels like an MR2. It feels like the logical evolution of the brand. And there's no doubt in my mind that this is a joyful little car. And I am, for one, grateful that I've had the opportunity to drive it today, because I've driven a lot of sports cars from this era. You know, I've owned, you know, MX-5s, I've had Lotus Elises as company cars, you know, I've owned BMW Z3s and Z4s. There's a part of me that can see an MR2 on my driveway in the future, and I have a funny feeling it could be one of these third generation ones. For me, the MR2 is a very important car in Toyota's history, because I believe that it was this car that really changed how we perceive Toyota as a brand outside of its domestic market. Yes, I know the Corolla GT twin cam is now the sort of poster child for that, but over here in Europe we've only just recently cottoned on to that car. But the MR2 was the first one that really showed that Toyota could be taken seriously by the enthusiasts. It maybe hasn't had the iconic and everlasting stature of the Mazda MX-5, but I do believe it is nonetheless as important as that car. The first generation car showed that Toyota could build a small, fun to drive, and more importantly, reliable sports car for the younger buyer. The Mark II, despite its flaws, showed a more sophisticated side to Toyota, something that would then later go on with things such as Lexus and their future products. And with the third generation car, despite the commercial unsuccess of it, it did show that Toyota cared about drivers, it cared about enthusiasts, and maybe that's the car that laid down a blueprint for the Toyotas that we have today for us enthusiasts, such as the GR Yaris, the GR86, and of course the Supra. And maybe in some respects, changing how people perceive your brand and altering that shift is more important than selling lots of cars. And if that is the case, then there's no doubt in my mind that the MR2 has always been and always will be a success story. Thank you for watching the first retro review on House of Cars. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, can you let me know what your thoughts are down in the comment section? Do you have an MR2? Did you own them? What are your memories of these fantastic little sports cars? Let me know them down in the comment section. And whilst you're there, if you're not already a subscriber, could you please become one? I'd really appreciate it. And then make sure you turn on your notifications, because then you'll get an alert when the next video is uploaded and it's gone live. And of course, if you want to see more of these retro reviews and you have ideas of what I should cover live, let me know there. Now remember, you can follow me on social media as well. I'm across on Instagram, and it is at House of Cars 1973. And remember, whether or not it is an old car or a new car, A slow car or a fast car, a small car or a large car, you'll find them all here in the House of Cars. Thanks again for watching. Thank you for your continued support. I'll see you again soon.